Hi everybody, I'm Amy, this is my wife Maggie.
Hello.
Together we are ThinkerThemer and we review games from two different perspectives. I'm all about the mechanics, Maggie is all about the theme, and today we are reviewing for you Stamp Swap by Stonemaier Games and designer Paul Sullivan. So let's get into it.
So in Stamp Swap, we are going to be stamp collectors coming up to a very exciting convention of stamp swapping and showcasing. And so over the course of 3 days, we're going to be collecting different stamps, making our collection, and then participating in different contests that are going to be judging our collection based on different attributes. Whoever ends up with the absolute best collection based on those criteria will be the winner.
Now, as Maggie mentioned, there are 3 days to this game: Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and each game is made up of 3 phases. At the core of this game is an I cut, you choose mechanic, which you don't see very frequently. So that is an interesting part of this game. But before that happens, we're all going to draft from a central supply of stamps. And the stamps that are going to be available for drafting are dictated by the cards that come out based on the number of players that show you what type of stamps to pull from this collection that we have here, and whether those stamps are going to be face up or face down. And it's not just stamps that we're going to be drafting, but sometimes there's also going to be exhibitor cards, which are going to give you unique scoring conditions for your puzzle, and specialists, which are going to give you unique powers that you can use throughout the course of the rest of the game. So in this first drafting or collection phase, in turn order, everyone's going to pick one item from this collection of things, but you're not really thinking about just what you want for your puzzle and the unique scoring conditions for this particular game. What you're thinking about is, what can I trade with other people? What do other people want? And what are they going to want to come over to me and grab in the I cut, you choose phase? So in the second part of the day, which is the swap part of the day, you are going to take all the goodies that you've put into your daily collection, i.e. all the items that you've drafted, and then you're going to cut them however you like into 2 different piles. But before you do that, you get to put one item in your reserve to keep for yourself, as long as it's not one of these special shiny stamps that have a lot of victory points built in. Once you've done that, you're making your 2 piles, and the tricky bit is that you're going to keep the pile that nobody selects. And so when you are splitting them, maybe you want to make one really attractive that people might go for, but secretly there's something in the other pile that you want to keep. So that's where you're trying to manipulate those piles so that people are taking the things you want and not the things that you don't want them to take. In turn order, we're going to go around and pick one of the 2 piles in front of other players. If no one picks your piles, you're going to end up keeping both of your own piles. Then everyone is going to place their stamps onto their puzzle, and then we're going to move into the show phase. The show phase is interesting because at the start of the game, everybody gets 3 tickets, and these tickets are going to allow you to enter into these different contests across the 3 days. However, there are 4 different objectives on the board, and you only have 3 tickets, and you're only going to be able to score one of these at the end of each round. They are variable for each game, but for example, this one is you're going to score 1 color that's on your board, and you're going to get 3 points per stamp that's on your board of that color. But then there's timing. So when do you want to spend that ticket to go into that contest across the 3 days? Because you have to score 1 at the end of each round. At the end of the game, there's also a final show which has a bigger objective that you're working towards throughout the course of the game, as well as some other minor things that score at the end of the game. The only one thing that I did want to talk about before we talk about how we felt about the game is this first player token, which is kind of interesting because this gets put into the collection of items that people are able to draft from and then split up in the I cut, you choose part of things. And so it becomes a bit of a commodity to have that first player advantage going into the swap phase in particular, where you're getting to choose one of those piles first. And you can see if you're left with it at the end of the game, it's going to give you 2 points. So that's a brief overview of how the game plays, but now let's talk about how we felt about it.
So the first thing I'll say about this is when it was first announced, there was a bit of commotion around the theme. Like, some people really resonate with it. Some people are like, oh, I don't know if I'm into stamps. Like, what is this as a theme? I have to say, I actually really enjoy it as a theme. I'm like, oh, actually, I've never been a stamp collector, but it's kind of interesting and intriguing. And
I mean, it's very adjacent to the board gaming hobby, collecting in general, conventions in general.
So I was actually really looking forward to it theme-wise.
Yeah, me too. I mean, we have a lot of fixation on hobbies and collecting things, and so this is for me. I'm like, oh, stamp collecting could be what bird watching was for Stonemaier games. So I love that they've picked a really unique theme. So we had high expectations going in. But unfortunately, this game fell a little flat for us. And so I want to start the review just by saying that there's probably an inherent bias that we have towards the mechanic of I cut, you choose. And actually, as we played this game, it kind of cemented that for us, that really it's not our favorite mechanic. So I want to talk about that for a little bit, because the first thing about I cut, you choose, and this is in general, not just about this game, is that one, it's a little bit trickier for newer players to get their head around. So even at a mid-weight game like this is, it's a bit harder to get into it. Yeah,
that concept of I am drafting, but the thing that I'm drafting is not what I get to keep. But wait, so then what do I want to draft? And so that's and as we experience it with newer players or casual players, they really struggle to kind of wrap their head around it.
Yeah, and of course we like heavy games, so that's not a problem for us. But the interesting thing is that feeling of whether it is satisfying to me is diminished a little bit when you're drafting, and the items that you're drafting are not necessarily the ones that you get to keep, like Maggie mentioned. So there's almost like I'm drafting. There's this strategy. Of course, there's a strategy of I'm drafting the things that I want other people to take. But then the added layer to that is the fact that really you are trying to dupe your opponents. Like there's a bluffing element or a meta kind of thing that's going on here, where you are trying to create these two piles and you're trying to manipulate people to take the pile that you want. And the idea of that, and this is true of, again, every I cut, you choose game that we've played. Some are more aggressive than others. This one's not particularly aggressive, but you're still trying to manipulate other players. And there's some people are going to really like that, and other people not so much.
Yeah, particularly with the face down stamps, because then that's where you're like, whoa, But so there's the element of which you could just leave it poker face, sort of just go, these are my two piles. You decide there might be something good or not, or you can be like, hey, there's something really good. It's face down. You really want it. So I don't tend to enjoy that as much.
But in this particular I cut, you choose, because we're here to review this game, there are some other dynamics going on. The first thing is that everyone is drafting from a pile that is randomly drawn based on these cards, and the stamps come out of here. Sometimes the stamps that come out of here have really appealing things that match the variable scoring conditions in this game, and that is of course that's really exciting because everybody wants the same thing, and we're drafting in turn order, and then we're swapping in turn order as well. But sometimes the draft is not that interesting because randomly the things that get pulled out and are shown are not that interesting for the scoring conditions. And on top of that, a lot of the items, as you can see here, are placed face down, which makes the draft and the swapping a little less satisfying. And so ultimately what happens is sometimes there's nothing that you want to draft around the table.
Yeah, sometimes you're looking around going, I'm forced to draft from someone, but literally nothing that I'm seeing is going to help me with my objective or any of the contests that I want to enter. So it's a bit like,
I guess I'll take your pile over there, which also has some mystery items in it. And so you're not entirely sure if even what you're taking from the other person is going to be useful to your puzzle, because then you turn over and reveal the stamps that were face down, and you're like, oh, okay, well, that wasn't as good as I thought, which some people will love, that kind of chance and that risk element. But for us, it just made it feel a little bit like sometimes there were rounds where the swap wasn't that engaging. And there's another dynamic in this game that it differs a little bit depending on the player count, but there's that element of if nobody chooses your two piles around the table, so everyone's picking a pile in front of someone else, then you just take the items that you've drafted.
And both piles,
but you take both piles. And so there's no swap in the swap phase, and that's kind of it creates another feeling of like, oh, well, I went to all this trouble to split them. And you could argue that, well, then you didn't do a great job of splitting your items because nobody wanted the two parts. You should have made one really appealing, so someone took that. But if you make the other one really appealing, then the one you're left with is also kind of garbage. So, you know, there's some interesting moments and fun moments where there's surprises, and especially with the swapping of the gold foil stamp, because it's worth so many points. There's a really interesting tension that brings in. But for the most part, I don't know, there was a lot of rounds where I was just like, oh, I'm not happy with what I got. I'm not happy with how I swapped with other people. And that was kind of a bit of a common feeling.
Yeah, for me, it's a thing of like, sometimes it's like, oh, I get to keep both piles. And there's like, oh, well, then I wish I had drafted the things that I actually wanted so that I could have made a better puzzle, because now I'm just left with like, okay, whatever. Or sometimes that actually works out quite well. I go, great, I get to keep everything. But it just, I think because it feels so almost kind of not random, but just hard to predict or hard to plan for, then it feels less strategic. It feels more like you're just kind of reacting to whatever's happening, and there's just not that longer term.
And I don't want to say it's not strategic, because everyone's going to write in the comments like, I Cut You Choose is very strategic about how you make those two piles, but there is just a random, the randomness of the draw combined with the face down stamps makes it, yes, as Maggie said, a little bit harder to predict. But when it comes to the puzzle itself, so the stamp puzzle that you're building out on your player board, that is the more fun element for us. And we love like a tile laying puzzle. And even though some of the inputs that you're getting into that puzzle can be a little bit random, you don't have as much control over what you're drafting to put on your puzzle. When you're putting them together, that is quite fun. And the thing that makes it fun, and my favorite thing about this game, are the limited tickets that you have, or you've got 3 tickets and there's 4 scoring conditions, and you're trying to time that because you have to score one at the end of each round. So for example, this small squares, I'm going to get 2 per small square like this stamp that I have on my board whenever I decide to place my ticket down and score that at the end of a round. But once I've scored that, I can't score it again. So I have to work out, well, am I going to be able to draft more small squares, and like, should I wait to do that later? Or am I working towards having a lot of one color? So you're kind of like being opportunistic, you're thinking about the order, which ones you are going to score and in which order. Yeah,
that is interesting. That whole, you having to, the timing of when to commit to each one of the, and then to which ones of those contests, it's good, because as Amy said, is that whole thing of like, ooh, I do have a lot of color going on, but if I wait another round, I'm gonna have even more, so I won't cash in on that now. Maybe I'll go for one of the other ones. So that works well.
And I really like that there's one big objective. So at the end of the game, for example, this one, for every complete edge that you've got on your board, you're going to get 10 points for each edge. So that's 40 points if you can do that by the end of the game. So everybody's also trying to do that with their puzzle. So it makes for a more interesting dynamic in terms of what shapes you're drafting and what you're taking from other people. And because everybody knows these are public information, well then of course you can use that to your advantage in the I Cut You Choose mechanic.
Another interesting dynamic is that the actual stamps have values on them, and some of them are quite positive, like these gold rare stamps can be quite high value, and some of them can actually even be negative because they're kind of worn off and they're not that very good quality or condition. On top of that, there's also these little infinity stamps, which I don't know thematically what they're meant to represent, but they become this sort of like majority game by the end of the game, where whoever has the most is going to get 10 points, second most, and then third player. So that becomes another, and it can often help fill in little gaps if you're trying to complete other objectives that might require, particular combinations or things to be filled, or corners or things like that.
Yeah, those are added like elements to the scoring in this game, which are really fun. There's also the specialists, the exhibitors, and then when you turn over these cards, this is quite a clever system. So I'll talk about this first. But depending on the number of players that you have in the game, that dictates how many of these cards you're going to turn over at the start of each round, which then tell you the combination of stamps and cards that are going to be available in the draft. That's a really clever way of randomizing that, actually.
Yeah.
But also there's an event-like statement on here that changes something about that round and the drafting. And that just adds a little bit of a twist to every round. I wouldn't say that it's like hugely game-changing or anything, but it does keep it interesting because there's a bit of excitement about what's happening this round. For example, this is first find. So on each player's turn during the collect phase, they must collect a stamp from the supply instead of the pool. So that means that, hey, I know I want this particular shape, and so I'm going to add that into the drafting and into the swap. So there are things that change that up. Also, you can, in the I cut you choose mechanic, you can choose to reserve one of these cards or put it out for offer to the rest of the players. So there's specialists that give you that ongoing ability. And then there's exhibitors which give you an additional scoring that happens at the end of every round. So example, this one would be 1 point per yellow stamp. And so you might take this not because you've got a lot of yellow stamps, but because someone else has a lot of yellow stamps and probably really wants to score that. So there's this interesting dynamic as well. It adds variability to the game, of course. I would say that, though, overall, each game feels similar. So there are only slight variations. The other variable element in this game is, of course, the scoring conditions. But each of these different colored groups of scoring conditions relates to the same overall
section or area.
So all the red ones are about color. All of the orange ones are about theme. And so there's slight variations on that, but enough to keep it interesting and enough that from game to game we're like, ooh, let's try different scoring conditions. So that gives you different objectives for your puzzle.
Okay, so now when it comes to the production of this actual game, now Stonemaier Games is known for doing really, really great productions. With this one, I found that one thing that consistently tripped myself and other people was the differentiation between the stamp themes themselves. So the stamps have the two categories are their color, which they have actually color, like the coding is the border, has a different border, so that helps you with kind of telling different colors apart if you have any sort of color difficulty or visual difficulty. But the themes were actually consistently quite difficult to tell apart. It's like space, monuments, animals, flowers, and vehicles. And the only way to differentiate them, aside from just like the image, but they actually, some of them are quite small, so it's hard to tell. It's like the background of them, like some of them have a solid background, some of them have no background, some of them have like very, very fine stripes this way or fine stripes. And so that was consistently something that people were like, wait, is this a vehicle or is this a
especially between space and vehicle and sometimes monuments. But space and vehicle, because there were like rockets in the space ones, it got a bit confusing and it tripped us up a number of times in our first few games. And every time we taught this to a group, that is probably the number one thing that they struggled with the most. So, and I think that's kind of related to the illustrations are beautiful.
Yeah, I really like the actually
really
individual
beautiful
illustrations.
Yeah, they're really nice. But the contrast of the colors in this game are very muted. And of course, this is a conscious decision to make the game look like an aged stamp. And that makes sense because thematically, of course, an aged stamp has that yellow hue to it, right? But overall, it just leads to a bit of a beige experience where you are really wanting to create this beautiful, vibrant collection of stamps. And so I think it actually diminishes the table presence of this game.
Yeah.
And what's strange is the stamps on the box and the stamps on the back of this board, if I can show you on the back of this board, are actually far more vibrant than on the actual tiles. And I've made a mess here.
You have. Oh, well, yeah. So I just had to kind of cut that as we remade the board. But the other aspect of this is the graphic design choice for the point tracker. So they've sort of gone with this choice of, you're only sort of signaling every 5 points. But then also there's like little elements of, there's like a clip and then not all of these boxes are the same size, and which visually is kind of cool. But when you're actually trying to track, 12 points, 33 points, 22 points, it becomes so difficult, like so tricky ability to very quickly, it slows that process down.
It does, and this is a strange one because it was really hard for us to work out why that was happening, and it wasn't just the two of us, but I was really struggling with counting out points on this point tracker, and then a friend was like, why is this so hard? I can't like wrap my head around where I'm meant to be putting my marker. And I think part of it as well is, of course, it's only a 50-point lap. So as soon as you get here, you have to go over 50, which, you know, confuses you a little bit. But there's also no individual numbers. And as Maggie mentioned, there's these different shapes along the way that I think slows down the processing. So I feel like that is just a choice that, you know, maybe could have been a little bit different. The things that I really did like about the production, of course, is this handy tray that keeps all of the different sized stamps really like just neatly organized, wonderful. The, of course, the foil on these beautiful rare stamps is so nice, and it does stand out because everything else is a bit muted. They really stand out.
Makes you feel really special when you get one of those.
So really love that. And then also the fact that the steps to the scoring are actually written on the board, and that's the kind of detail that you expect from Stonemaier games. So really enjoy that, and because you can get a little bit lost in what step you're at because there's a scoring that happens at the end of every round, we could just follow that, and that made everything really easy.
So talking about player count, I'll start with the solo mode. There is a solo mode. There's an automa, I believe her name is Pincetta, which is tweezers in Italian, and it's always Italian because it's sort of a callback to the automa from viticulture. So they're always using Italian words in, what do you call it, in celebration of that. Now, the way Pincetta works is the back of many of the boards have, actually only 3 of them, I wonder if, that's one of them, that's her board, and that's where you're going to be allocating different stamps. Now, she actually has her own deck of cards, so you're actually going to be replacing these ones. You're going to be using these ones to decide what are going to be the tiles that she's going to be collecting, so they're going to be coming straight from the supply, and that is going to tell you she's going to have a large pile and a small pile, and then you're going to be drafting another one to then, it'll tell you essentially what are the cards that, the tiles, the stamps that you're going to be getting. And so then you get to decide how you split them. And then depending on Pincetta's objective, so she also going to have some objectives based on what she's trying to achieve. She's going to be allocating these little tokens, which will sort of make one pile more valuable to her than the other. And then there's also these other cards, where are they? These ones, that then you'll draft to see randomly how many of these tokens are going to be removed. So again, that can kind of all of a sudden shift the preference so that you can't fully predict, oh, she's definitely going to take this pile, so I'm just going to strategically, you know, make things this or that way. So there, that happens. These are also going to be, again, like the way that those piles work is they all will be allocated depending on, like, for example, if they're rare stamps, they'll go here. If they're infinity stamps, here. If they're value 2 to 3, she's also going to have particular ones that she's going to be invested in getting. And then there's also a different type of card, which is at the time of doing the scoring for the contest, one of these will be flipped and it'll tell you which contest she's going to be going for, where she's going to be putting her ticket, and it'll just be based on the number on that contest card and the level of difficulty that you've decided. It's just the automatic number of points that she's going to be getting, and then that gets multiplied. If it's the first round, second round, or third round, it's going to be more points the further it is, because, you know, in theory she's collected more things. So there are quite a number of things that you're facilitating.
I will just add in though, how difficult it is to replicate the idea of an I cut you choose mechanic, because inherently it relies on a person making those decisions.
It's not really something that lends itself to I'll just play my own game sort of thing. If you're needing to replicate an automa, it's inevitably going to be a little bit kind of cumbersome. So it's definitely not the type of automa that I would ever choose to play with, because there's just far too many steps, far too much facilitation. But again, some people really don't mind that, and they actually quite enjoy the challenge of going, oh, you know what? And there's also a way of scaling the difficulty, because again, at the end of it, there's a variability of different cards that tells you, depending on how many stamps ended up in each area, multiply that by these points. And so that's when then she does her big sort of point reveal kind of at the end as well. So overall, it's an interesting implementation, but it's not not one that I would play because of the heavy facilitation needed.
Yeah, and in terms of the scaling, you can imagine that this scales better at like a higher player count than a lower player count, so maybe not solid 2 players. It actually, there's no rule variation aside from the number of items that are getting put out to draft, but of course there's only one person to swap with, and so you know that you're kind of trying to, it's like head to head trying to make a pile that, you know, is not that useful for me if Maggie's making the draft. So it's just like that head to head dynamic, whereas when there's more players, of course there's much more choice, which makes it a little bit more interesting. My preferred player count was 3. At 4 and 5, it's just started to get, you know, a little bit more, there were people who are left with, you know, no choice being given, although that happens at lower player counts as well. But I don't know, it just felt like I liked it at 3. It was like I could choose from 4 piles and it was, you know, a faster game. So I probably prefer 3 player counts.
Same with me.
Yeah, so let's get into our ratings for this game with everything. If you're jumping ahead to this timestamp, please go back and hear what we had to say about our reasons for these ratings. A lot of that comes down to the I cut, you choose mechanic. And it not being our favorite mechanic. If you need more evidence of that, Hanamakoji is a very well-loved game, and I think it's just fine. but mostly because of the I cut, because of the main mechanic.
Same with like It's a Wonderful World, which I love, and then It's a Wonderful Kingdom, which brings in that I cut, you choose.
One.
I did not like that at all. So it's like the same kind of game almost, with just that added I cut, you choose. Like, not for me.
And we really do enjoy most Stonemaier games and most Paul Solomon games, but for those reasons, this game I'm giving a 7, which is, you know, it's fun. I would absolutely play this at any time, but in a year for me that has so many great mid-weight games, like I'm thinking Harmony's Art Society of last year, which this game will get compared to a lot, that has a bidding mechanic instead that I prefer, as well as the recent, you know, Fairy Ring that we covered. It's a highly competitive year. So I have to give this one a 7.
I'm actually a little bit higher. I'm a 7.3 because again, like when I'm playing this, it's like I'm having a fine time. Like at no point I'm like, oh, I can't believe I'm like this is a, you know, it's a fine game. But it just I had higher expectations for it. I really wanted to just love it and be like, oh, this is just like I just want to keep pulling this off the shelf, and it just wasn't that for me.
So but you may like this. If anything that we've said earlier in this review is the opposite of your taste, well then you might love this game. But we hope that this was helpful. If it was, please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and we'll be back with more board game content soon. But otherwise, bye for now.
Bye.